Hi everyone, and welcome to our second video cast of the Thinking and Language unit. Today we're going to focus on language. So last time we did thinking, and today we're going to do language. All right, before we get started talking maybe a little bit more about the psychology of language, it's really important that you understand some basic parts of our language that psychologists consider when we study language. So the first thing is that we know what is language, right? It's a spoken, written, or gestured works and the way that we combine them to communicate meaning. So language is spoken, written, or gestures that communicate meaning between people or, among people from one person to the next. So, and then we have a phoneme, all right? A phoneme is it's the smallest unit of sound. So, for example, in the word bat, right? Bat has three phonemes. B-a-t. Right? I know that sounds silly because you say it as bat, but actually, b-a-t, those are all separate phonemes. Chat actually also has three phonemes. It's ch-a-t, ch, right? That ch sound, ch, right? And so you learn this a lot, like, what the GHT means, or pH is f, right? So those are the smallest units of sound, phoneme sound. Pick up the phone, you hear it ring, right? Phoneme sound. Morpheme in language is the smallest unit that carries meaning, okay? So instead of it carrying a sound, it carries meaning. And the word may be an actual just word, or it could be part of a word, like a prefix or a suffix. So an example of just a word as a morpheme is milk, right? Pumpkin actually has two, pump and kin. Unforgettable has four, unforgettable, right? Table. So those are three, this is, it's one, these are three examples where it's 1, 2, and 4 morphemes, right? And the idea here is that morphemes are the smallest part of meaning, morpheme meaning, okay? So don't get confused with phoneme and morpheme. All right, so moving on to grammar, right? Grammar is a system of rules in a language. It enables us to communicate with each other and actually understand each other. So, we all have rules that we have to follow, and not everyone's grammar rules are the same in each language around the world. Grammar has two parts, semantics and syntax. So, semantics are like the set of rules that we derive meaning from morphemes, words, and sentences. So, an example of semantics would be that ed added to the word laugh, it's you laughed in the past. That ed means in the past. So that's a semantic rule. Syntax is the rule for combining words in a sentence that actually makes grammatical sense. So, in English, you would say it's a white house, and in Spanish and lots of other languages, you would say house white, Casa Blanca, right? You would switch them. So that's like an example of a syntax rule. All right, so what are some universals about language? So it doesn't matter what language you speak, where you are in the world, what it looks like, and no matter what, right? There's a couple of things that are universal. The first one is that it's totally arbitrary. So in English, the word is dog, right? And in French, it's chien. But both of them are made up. They don't have any inherent meaning, okay? Displacement. So language is the only form of communication that allows us to discuss events that have already happened and that will happen or that may not happen at all. So it allows us to talk about the future and the past. And then vocal auditory channel. So this is the idea that all cultures rely on the vocal auditory channel as the primary form of communication. Sign language is an exception, but only because the vocal auditory channel is compromised. So sign language is the only exception to that rule. All right, what about kids? How do they get language? So it's a little bit about this when we were talking about the development of infants and toddlers, but let's just go over it again in a little more depth. So language, right? All of us are born to recognize speech sounds from all over the world. If you look at a 6-month-old, right, they can identify up to 90% of like the phonemes in the Hindi language, right? But then down to 12 months, or even an English-speaking adult can be, 0 or 10%. So you start being able to recognize all the phonemes in the entire, whatever speech sound possible. But then as you don't hear them, that kind of goes away and you can no longer recognize those sounds. All right, what are the stages of language? Babbling stage. 3 to 4 months, they utter various sounds and it doesn't really make any kind of sense, right? Goo goo, gaga, those kinds of things. Then you have the one-word stage. This is where they start to name things. It's called a naming stage, like mama, papa, or dada, or like dog, right? So they just, single words. Then you have the two-word stage. This is where they start to combine words, mommy, milk, right? So they're not using verbs. Particularly they're just combining them. And now they're starting to get grammar. Like they wouldn't say milk, mommy, they would say mommy, milk. So they're starting to get things that kind of figure out how the order goes. And then early speech, telegraphic speech is it's like a telegraph, right? That's what they call it that. So it's an early speech stage when they speak like a telegraph. Go car, right? They don't say like the car is going, right? Or like the car needs to go. They like get out those auxiliary or those words that they don't really think are necessary. At 2 years old, children also start to use morphemes, right? Showing tense. So like, he walks, they walked, I am walking, right? And they make this big mistake that's called overgeneralization or overregularization, where they say like, I hit it, or he broke it, or he break it, right? So they like, use the rules, but they use them incorrectly, right? They start to use words with abstract meaning, so like dream, forgot, pretend, and they use words that refer to emotions starting around 2 years old. And then after cognitive advances in later childhood, they can use highly abstract words like you guys can today. So here's just another chart of that, okay? All right, so how do kids get language, right? We know the stages they get it, but how do they get it? So there's two major theorists you have to know. The first is the behaviorist theory of B.F. Skinner, right? We've talked about behaviorist theory. This is that they believe that learning by your environment. Skinner is the operant conditioning guy, right? So he's the reinforcement guy. So a little kid says something and they get a smile. A little kid says, Mama, and, oh, yay, he knows who I am. And he gets a big hug and he figures like, yes, I got it right? He gets a reinforcement, good job, right? And through modeling, right? So the kid says, I broke it, and you say, you're right, it is broken. So you like model for them the correct way to say and then eventually get it. The opposite side of that is a guy named Chomsky, and he believes that children are born with a mental structure that allows vocabulary and grammar to go into their environment. And this structure is called the language acquisition device. And kind of like the way that he proves his theory is by saying that kids say words they've never heard. So a child has never heard the word hitted, like I hitted it, but they will still use hitted it because they will combine hit and ed inappropriately instead of just I hit it. And the idea here is that it's kind of a combination of both, right? It's never just one or the other. So yes, we have our genes, a genetic design that gives us a brain which has certain mechanisms for understanding language, right? The Broca's and the Wernicke's area. Then the environment makes you hear that language, and then you're able to master the native language. So it's a combination of both, of course, right? The older you get, the harder it is to learn a language, right? And I think what's the coolest part of talking about language is something called linguistic relativity or linguistic determinism. So this guy, his name is Worf, he has a hypothesis that language actually determines the way that you think. So the idea that what words are available in your language or what words you know actually determine your ability to think about certain things. An example of this is that the Hopi tribe does not even have they don't have any words for past tense, right? So they literally do not think about the past because they're not able to speak about it, so they don't think about it. Another example of how the language determines the way that you think is people who are bilingual. They actually report like having a different sense of self depending on which language they're speaking. Specifically, like English has a very rich vocab for self-focused emotions like anger and sadness and happiness, while Japanese has more words for interpersonal things like sympathy. So you might feel more self-focused or more other-focused based on what language you're speaking in. And actually, people who are bilingual, they get different scores on personality tests based on which language the test is in, right? Which is like really crazy because they're the exact same person. But the language actually shapes their personality and their thinking. Pretty cool, huh? All right, last but not least, animals and thinking. So from apes to birds, we know that all of animals they can form concepts, all right? And they did an experiment with monkeys trying to get a banana, and they found that monkeys display insight. They problem solve, all of a sudden, aha, the idea comes to them, and they figure out how to get the banana down. Okay, here's a whole bunch of very famous chimps or monkeys that have learned language, and I'll show you video clips of them in class. You have Washoe, Coco, and Lana, and they use keyboards or different sign languages, and they have between 150 and 500 or 130 and 500 words, and they can combine words. The opposite of that to that argument is that they can't learn complex sentences. They're just mimicking their trainer, and there's like some sort of experimenter bias. So the experimenter knows what they're trying to get what they're trying to get the animal to do, and so the experimenter is maybe more likely to read into something that is actually there. All right? So that's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.